The topic of human subject research is so broad, one can legitimately ask why I chose to focus on an era in American human research and international human research that represents a bad example. Turns out that Mr. Weiner and I have given this a lot of thought, and we co-authored a chapter in a book focusing on the research that went on during the Nazi era and the disrespect for human rights, for individuality, for all of the things that we take for granted in interpersonal relations were ignored in the interest of pursuing new knowledge and applied knowledge. I think it pays to recall some of that, and I'm not going to be able to go into very much detail of this history, but Google does a great job. If you take down some of the keywords that I will share with you and look at the examples that you can find through Google, you're going to be amazed. You're going to say, how could this possibly happen? And yet it did. And you're going to prepare a protocol. You're going to submit the protocol to the IRB. The IRB is going to make demands of you. And by understanding some of this history, you will understand why those demands are being made of you, why the IRB insists on a consent form that the potential subject can understand, why are your activities as a scientist restricted and limited and bounded by human considerations that are relatively new in the history of science. We know that World War II and the Nazi era characterized the late 1930s, early 1940s, ancient history, right? But most of the guidelines, most of the roadmaps of doing human clinical research evolved even later than the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. And there were what we would consider atrocities going on in the United States, funded by the United States government in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. And our regulations have been a response to the recognition that that shouldn't happen. So I guess the rationale for discussing this topic in this particular series is to give you understanding and give you sympathy for the guidelines and pathways that you need to follow today in order to have the privilege of using human subjects to answer research questions. So, forward. some history. The Nuremberg Code was written in 1946 as a direct response to the trials held of the Nazi medical atrocity perpetrators. They resulted in essentially no laws, no guidelines. The Declaration of Helsinki, which was another international conference, which essentially stated what research ought to consider. You'll note there that the first meeting was 1964, long after the Nuremberg Code, and the meetings continue, the last being in 2008, again, with evolving declarations focusing on human research. These are wonderful documents. None of them is terribly long. And again, Googling them and reading them would be a useful part of your background as a potential and active clinical researcher. The Belmont Report, 1978, again, long after World War II was over. And the Clinical Trial Volunteers Bill of Rights, which is sort of the last document that has been widely disseminated, addressing what a volunteer should expect from the clinical trial team soliciting their participation in a clinical research effort. And that was 2002. So while we're casting this in the light of history, a lot of that history is now. I mentioned that Helsinki evolves over a number of years. These are just a chronology of the conferences that have been held since June of 1964, the international nature of those conferences, and I can assure you that very serious people attended those conferences grappling with human experimentation and the obligations of the human researcher, the expectations of the human subjects. There was an exhibit in town about 3 years ago, which was a transformative opportunity, and if you are in Washington, you can still see that exhibit. The exhibit was called Deadly Medicine. In the Clinical Research Training Library, there are 2 or 3 copies of the exhibit book for your reference. But it was here in New Orleans at the World War II Museum in 2012. And the permanent home, as I mentioned, is in the Holocaust Museum in Washington. It emphasizes how the science of eugenics, which, by the way, in the 30s and 40s in the United States was a hotly pursued discipline, to the extent that it resulted in laws permitting the prophylactic sterilization of women who were deemed not quite typical of the mothers we want to bear future generations. Okay. This is the United States of America. The state of Indiana was one of the states that passed the laws that time was 1930, 1940. We're not talking about an obscure country, an obscure village at a distant time. And again, that was a corruption of the fundamental science that Darwin popularized about how evolution occurred. So the pursuit of scientific facts is marvelous. We all do that. How those facts are then embedded and incorporated in society is not always scientific. So there were a host of well-trained, good scientists committing atrocities in the name of good science. Within the Nazi environment, where the national objective was to purify the race, there were people who were very good scientists who perpetrated bad science in pursuit of this national goal that they bought into. And there were also, frankly, bad scientists who hid under the umbrella of the national goal to do mischief in the name of science. I'll give you some examples of some discoveries that were discovered wrongly and badly. But nevertheless, they evolved to, anybody ever go on a boat? Anybody ever wear a life jacket? You know how that life jacket was designed? You now have a little collar behind your head? Well, that came to be because the earlier iterations didn't have that, and the prisoners that were dunked in deep water didn't make it. But the prisoners that were dunked in good deep water with that little collar behind, they made it. So you have a life jacket. And the way it evolved and the way it proved useful isn't very pretty. But over the years, we've adopted the useful life jacket, even though it was wrongly conceived and wrongly invented, and lots of people lost their lives who had no choice but to participate in the experimentation. Anybody ever fly in an airplane? Commercial airplane? You know that at about 6,500 feet, the cabin becomes pressurized. Once again, it was determined that when you don't do it, people die. And that was determined by people dying in the attempt at trying to determine scientifically the altitude at which you need pressurization. Sound experiment should never have been done. So these are examples that you can relate to because they're not ancient. But what you need to watch out for is that the pursuit of modern questions using modern science doesn't fall into the same trap of discovery at the expense of human standards. So we have a Master's in Science of Clinical Research course. That's a 3-year curriculum. It was developed in 1999, I guess, when the NIH funded the K-30 grant series, because it was realized that clinical research was becoming an offshore sport, and there weren't enough people in America pursuing clinical research for a variety of reasons. So there is opportunity for funding to acquire special knowledge in clinical research, and Tulane has a master's program in clinical research. And during that curriculum, we discuss issues concerning the ethics of clinical research and how to conduct ethical clinical research. One of our discussions is the rationale for regulatory oversight in the proper conduct of clinical research. Institutions such as Tulane have an institutional review board made up of both professionals and community volunteers, a mix of physicians and PhD scientists and clergy, and these people give their time to reviewing research. They all go through an orientation which goes into some of the issues that we're discussing today in more depth. And they sit as the institutional's review board to assure that the research going on within the institution adheres to the standards that we accept today and doesn't lapse into the standards that we now know are wrong. So we discuss in our class what were the post-World War II violations that occurred in the United States, not in big bad Nazi Germany, not in Japan, here in the United States. So in Tuskegee, there were men who were infected with syphilis for the purpose of determining what the natural history of syphilis was, in an era when we already had penicillin, but they weren't given any. The United States Public Health Service funded a huge study in Nicaragua asking the same question. Again, intentional infection with syphilis, withholding an antibiotic that was already known to cure it, and enlisting people to be observed as the disease consumes them. Again, not Japan, not Nazi Germany. This was good old USA. What we know about hepatitis and what we know about the immune response to hepatitis was learned at Willowbrook, which was a home in Brooklyn, New York, or outside of Brooklyn, New York, for orphans, for abandoned children who lived in a group and a population in which hepatitis was rampant because of the close living quarters and the primitive sanitation, sharing of eating utensils, the whole 9 yards. observing these children and, in fact, giving body fluids from known infected children to children who were not infected were human experiments with deceptive descriptions and signed consent performed at Willowbrook, and forms the basis of largely what we know about the immune system's relation to hepatitis, and ultimately, today, how to immunize against hepatitis. Studying stress was important a few decades ago, still important. Nobody's eliminated stress. But Milgram had a group of volunteers who thought they were giving graded amounts of shock. Turns out they weren't, but the volunteers certainly thought they did. And to people who answered questions wrong. And the objective was to find out how teachers responded to stress. Humphrey wanted to study sexual conduct and duped a cohort of homosexuals into confiding in him, and then abused the relationship by using the information that was given to him in confidence inappropriately. And these are all human experiments that made some sort of publishable contribution, done wrong, and done not too long ago. And there are other examples also. So, because of these abuses by good scientists, we have gradually institutionalized human subject review and human research review. The institutional review board that you work with is institutionally unique. It adheres to guidelines that are federal, but a lot of autonomy is given to the institution in the formation of the review board, the process of review. And there's this balance between regulating and over-policing. And for those who understand the institutional review process and human subject review, it's really a very delicate balance between maintaining the autonomy of the institution in regulating the research that goes on within its walls and adherence to nationally accepted and internationally accepted standards. So I would suggest that you try to understand your institution's, whatever institution you're at, your institution's process for human subject research review. More than that, I suggest you try to participate in the process. I don't think there's a human subject review board in the country that isn't looking for volunteers who are willing to be oriented, trained, and participate. So let me give you an example of some of the discussion questions that our master scholars have brought up. Remember, in 1946, the Nuremberg Principles evolved mostly as a result of the Nuremberg trials. And who articulated these principles? Did the Nuremberg Principles in 1946 reflect American values or international European values? Paradoxically, they probably did much more to drive those values than they did to reflect those values. Because a lot of bad research, bad by our standards, today, was ongoing in Europe, in the United States, in Asia, in violation of nothing, because there was nothing for that bad research to be in violation of. Why did Helsinki evolve over so long a period of time? And probably we'll have another meeting sometime as soon as people get the right people together and a pleasant place to have a meeting. There have been some legal foundations evolving from the Helsinki Code, and there is within the Department of Health and Human Services the authority to regulate human research. And not only human, animal research too, and primate research, and special considerations regarding molecular, genetic research. So there have been regulations and laws, but they were very, very slow to come. If you consider Nuremberg a point in time, our laws have come 50 years later. We took some examples. I mentioned in the Nazi era that there were good scientists who did bad research because they were caught up in a national effort and felt that they were participating in it. There were others who were outstanding scientists or who were corrupted by what they did, but there were other people who were rogues and who probably could never have made a living as a good scientist, who thrived because they found an outlet in fulfilling national objectives. Joseph Mengele was probably one of those rogues. Probably would have never gotten an NIH grant. On the other hand, Gerhard Rose, whose science was no less atrocious than Joseph Mengele's, probably would have gotten an NIH grant in the current era where the funding level is at 8%. And the type of whimsical rogue characterized by Joseph Mengele had a lot of productivity that could be comparable to expert scientists like Gerhard Rose. The atmosphere had a lot to do with it. We had a stimulating class discussion of what could make good scientists do bad things, and how important the environment in which you live and function is in how you behave. And an institution such as Tulane that has an institutional review board sort of sets an environmental standard. And the institution itself contributes by paying attention to the environment that it supports. It contributes to good people doing good research. We spoke about the life jacket. We spoke about the altitude. There was lively discussion on how ill-begotten knowledge can be accepted, adopted, implemented, and enjoyed. But it can be. We discussed the issue of informed consent, and most people in class have something that they brought up as what they considered legitimate slight deception. What is full disclosure? How important is it for the patient subject to really understand the elements of the research they're being asked to participate in? There are people who point to valid behavioral research where they seriously wondered whether the research could ever be done without some element of deception. I think a purist would say that's the researcher's problem. Figure it out. Others would say that could be modified by risk. If the research can be informative and very low or minimal risk, could you possibly justify an element of deception? I guess in the best of all possible worlds, you would minimize the risk, minimize the deception, and submit it to your peers in a research evaluation forum, and then resubmit it to what is the public in the institutional review board. And if both of those bodies accept it, you may be able to do it. One asks, does one ethical principle trump another? If part of your rationale for doing the research is imposing risk in the interest of some greater good, again, how much risk, how much greater good, and who says so? are the types of things you need to contend with. One of the examples that's brought up, all of the drugs that are useful today have gone through a process, and near the beginning of that process is human subject research for the purpose of defining toxicity with no therapeutic intent. That's phase 1 clinical trial. After sitting through as many minutes as you have of this lecture, that concept should boggle your mind. Here you're asking people to participate to define toxicity with no balance of good. Well, once again, before a drug gets to that level, there are preclinical, laboratory, a variety of studies trying as best we can to define the possible risk. The experimental design is specifically pointed to minimizing that risk, and the rationale for doing it is that the subject may benefit, but the drug is being developed in order to benefit, ultimately, people with a certain disease or disease spectrum. And the research design is pointed to identifying toxicity at the earliest possible point, minimizing the subjects exposed to the toxic risk, and confirming the safety at the subtoxic doses. Now, this last sentence on this slide is something that I think we all should pay attention to and take seriously. We're called on to self-regulate in many, many different things. It's impossible for a scientist not to be conflicted. If a scientist didn't want the answer to a question, he or she would not be doing the science. So there needs to be external regulation, there needs to be external review, there needs to be external supervision, and these are very, very important in helping us avoid the accidental atrocity. So I think you all should revisit Nuremberg, Helsinki, Belmont, and Human Bill of Rights, Human Subjects Bill of Rights. Biostatistics is one of the means we have of protecting patients by defining the minimum number of subjects that need to be put at risk in order to get an answer. And it's important to know biostatistics. It's important to apply biostatistics so that you can minimize the risk to a population of human subjects and still get a scientifically valid answer. And the principles that have evolved need to be congruent with good science. So recognizing and respecting patient-subject autonomy, assuring that there is beneficence in the research that you're performing, that the research will be useful, that there is justice, and justice, remember, applies to accessibility and availability. So when you select your patient population, you need to select your patient population with an eye towards the future to be sure that what you learn can be applied to the broadest population within the scope of your subject population. There was a landmark study in breast cancer demonstrating that in women with high-risk breast radiology, lots of microcalcifications and maybe some atypical cells in the breast, if those women were given tamoxifen, which is a rather benign anti-hormone drug, they had a very good chance, over a 50% chance, of they would reduce their risk of breast cancer by over 50%. 13,500 people were accrued to the clinical trial. They were randomized to tamoxifen or not. Only 1% of the study population was African American. When an African American woman comes to my clinic today with a scary mammogram, I'm on very thin scientific ice when I offer her tamoxifen to reduce her risk of breast cancer. So justice is a principle that was violated in that huge study. And we need to be conscious of that. We need to protect, and we need to recognize that the PI is responsible for every aspect of the research, the people carrying it out, the questions being asked, the methodology being used to answer the question, the analysis of the data, and the conclusions drawn therefrom. It's a very responsible position to be a PI. So, again, based on our class discussions, we talked about how do we deal with ill-begotten knowledge. We talked about how to guard against future lapses. And here again, drawing the review body from the public as well as invested professionals, making sure that a scientific committee is satisfied with the soundness of the science, having inviolable standards that restrict the scope of the human research that is done, are all important and all vital. And remembering that new knowledge will produce new challenges, we need to constantly keep our guard up.
Is there a prevailing view on what to do with ill-begotten knowledge that, if it was ill-begotten prior to us having regulations? What's the prevailing view on what to do with that?
Everybody seems pretty comfortable using a life vest.
There were still some studies that are under lock and key, specifically from World War II.
Under lock and
I
key.
mean, in the sense that they're not published, they're not public knowledge. There are some studies that only a subset of the population.
You bring up an excellent point. There was legislation passed about 11 years ago that required every human subject research protocol in the United States to be registered on clinicaltrials.gov. And it was required that within X number of years, I think X is 2, of the close of the study at the accrual goals, that the data be posted on clinicaltrials.gov. That hasn't happened. And the reason it hasn't happened is that it turns out having a law is one thing. Having rules for implementation of the law, unfortunately, is another thing. And the rules for implementation of the posting of results on clinicaltrials.gov have never been adopted. The law sits there, the law states, but the rules for implementation have never been adopted. But one can say that it is against the law for human subject research to remain, the results to remain under lock and key. To give you my particular view of why the rules have never been adopted is that pharmaceutical companies sponsor a lot of research, and because of their investment in product development, don't like negative studies out there. And I believe they have exerted political pressure to retard the passing of the rules to implement the disclosure. But I don't think there is anything legitimate that is keeping results under lock and key, no matter how they were obtained. Do you know anything different from that, Brian?
No. I mean, you're right. I think until either someone makes a lawsuit about it or you know.
Okay. I don't know where I got the misperception on, because I don't know if it was at a Holocaust museum or some subset of experience I've been through, and they mentioned that there were certain studies that the results had been kept from publication, but I don't know.
Oh, during the Nazi era?
Not yet. Yes, and because of what they had done, they just were not and it was whether or not it would be acceptable. There were a lot of debates about whether or not it is acceptable now to publish what had already been discovered. I guess is kind of maybe a backwards way of looking at it.
I think anything that has come to light is in the public domain.
I'm talking about things that were kept from publication, that were discovered, that keep them from coming out because they don't want to continue to say, oh, actually, the study happened to, and the study happened to, and the study happened to.
Okay.
I don't know if I'm
We have a long history of that. Pharmaceutical companies bury negative studies all the time. It's illegal, but the rules to enforce it have not been implemented. The exhibit from the Holocaust Museum displays notebooks of details of human experimentation that certainly did not meet our standards and are there. I don't think today there is a legal means for burying data.
I'm going there next week, so I'll see if I can find out.
Yeah, I think it was Israel actually, but I'm not sure. I haven't been going here.
So these are some things that hit the newspaper recently, about a year or so ago. One was in the Wall Street Journal, 2012. The Hubertus Strughold Award for outstanding work in aviation medicine by the Space Medicine Association honored work by someone who did these altitude studies that I mentioned earlier. And Stanley Milgram's shock experiments were publicized in 2013 in the book review section of the New York Times. So these classical examples of research abuse surface from time to time. So we really don't know how to deal with the innovators, life jackets type of things. But we have learned to accept the innovation, and it's kind of like one of those things. And again, I mentioned this clinical trial. We are morally and ethically bound, and the Institutional Review Board oversees this. When we design a clinical trial, we need to adhere to justice. We need to provide equal opportunity within the clinical trial, despite the fact that our nation sponsored a clinical trial that did not do that. But I want you to understand that the average clinician is now at a loss for guidelines because of the failure of enforcing justice in clinical research. So think of these questions. What are values? How do we achieve them? How are they immutable? Are codes enough, or do they have to be laws? To whom do we delegate oversight? Our IRB, our compliance officer, internal audits, external audits, peer review, and I emphasize that whenever you can, participate in peer review. Be a part of the process, and in so doing, you'll be a better investigator. There are also ethical challenges that don't appear on the slide because we don't know what they are. We have to be prepared for those as well. Maintain vigilance. We have to learn what our values are and act consistently with them. We need to accept oversight and participate in the oversight process. And believe me, technology will complicate our decision-making and our choices of the future. We just need to accept it and be prepared for it. I heard a talk a couple of years ago in which the speaker said, "What keeps me up at night? Worry that we will lose the communal shame for the atrocities committed in the name of research and public policy during the Holocaust." It's that shame, communal shame, for the Holocaust, for Nicaragua, for Tuscaloosa, for things that have been done that help us from slipping again or slipping further. Thank you.
And to Dr. Wing's point about serving on the IRB, if anyone would be interested in sitting on Tulane's IRB, please contact me. I think it's probably one of the best ways to learn how to successfully complete an IRB submission and get it